Yo, 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 Dom!
Jenna, hi. Yeah, I know you're excited. I figure you would be.
Of course I am. Okay, first and foremost, my voice is a little bit hoarse because I was yelling, and I'm still in my pajamas because your girl was up late last night.
And for those listening and not seeing this, it's because Jenna, why were you up late last night?
Because the Knicks advanced that. Okay, so here's the thing. If you're a New York Knicks fan, you like just whoa is really what all the hats should say, just like a tale of woe. But for the first time in like, I think it's 25, 24 years since 1999, the Knicks have advanced out of the second. We're going to the Eastern Conference Finals, out of the second round of the finals. And we're going to the Eastern Conference Finals. And we're facing in okay, anyway, I could keep going. Let's start the show. Hi, I'm Jenna.
And I'm Dom. You know what's funny? Not long ago, we were both breaking news. Now we're
Breaking unemployment records.
exactly just like thousands of other journalists who've been laid off from newsrooms across the country.
Yeah, and after the shock wore off, we kept asking ourselves, what the hell do we do now?
And over many, many cups of coffee,
And maybe a few drinks.
we realized we had a unique opportunity here. Why not pull back the curtain on what's really happening in American media?
Right? I mean, we've spent years in this industry seeing how stories get made or don't, and now we can actually talk about it.
And trust me, there's a lot to talk about. From local news disappearing to social media reshaping journalism, we'll break it all down.
And look, we're not here to lecture anybody. We just want to help make sense of the information that we're getting and maybe have some much needed fun along the way.
So whether you're glued to the news, just trying to figure out what's real in your feed, or curious about the future of media, come hang with us.
Welcome to Laid Off and Looking, a podcast where two journalists
Are taking a critical look at American media.
So as I was saying, we've advanced out of the second round. First of all, we beat Boston. Like that's a whole thing. And like if you're a
Thank
New Yorker,
goodness.
you know why. Anyway, so
Mm.
that's A. And then B, we're facing Indiana. And that's a whole nother like rivalry thing that goes all the way back to actually it goes back like I think further than the 90s. But really 90s Knicks is really when I sort of like came aware. And that's the last time that they actually went. Anyway, so like, this is huge. This was like an amazing game. They came, usually the Knicks, like, they can be a little bit wobbly, a little bit wonky sometimes in like the first half of the game, the first, second quarter,
Right.
and then maybe like start to pull it. And then if they're going to do it, it's the fourth quarter where like something clicks and they're able to turn it around. This game, and this was, by the way, so this was game six of a best
Okay.
of seven series
Right.
against Boston. And they lost the first two games and then sorry, not they no. Boston lost the first two games
Okay.
because the Knicks were up 2-1, which first of all,
Okay.
as Knicks fans, we were just like, wait, so th- this could happen. Okay, so first of all, that happened. And then they lose a game and because they even one of the games they won was in Boston, which is like amazing. But then they lose a game and then they lost a game at home. They lost a game in Boston
Okay.
to the Celtics. And so it was basically like 3-1 is where the series going into game
Okay.
six was. And they were back at the Garden because Knicks had home court advantage. And so like all they had to do was just win one game and then we advance out of like round two of the finals or not the finals, excuse me, of like, the playoff series. And so that which gets us one step closer. Like, what if? Like some people have said it. I dare not say it. I'm not going to jinx it for my guys,
Right.
but
Right.
this is big. So we get to game six. The Garden is like just I wasn't there, but I can only imagine like the energy. When the Garden is on,
It's
it's
yeah.
on. Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah. It's
They came out of the gate dominating, absolutely dominating in a way that like I don't think I've seen them play like that. Like at least not in like the postseason. Like I mean, literally the command that they had over the game. Now, in all fairness, I should clarify that Boston did one of their players, Jason Tatum, did suffer just a horrific injury. I think
mhm.
he tore his Achilles, which the ish looks excruciatingly painful. I do wish him a swift and full recovery but in all fairness, like we beat them twice, even with Tatum on the team. So it's not like the Knicks didn't have it in them, but that was also a factor, I will say. So they won. And
Well,
then,
I think it's amazing because I think I love the fact, the energy. This is the thing about New York sports. Whatever a New York team wins something, I mean, I'm a Met fan. Lifer Met fan. I know.
oh,
And it's like we don't have any
you
we
didn't do
often
well in the Subway
no
Series.
no we we but I love but I people all get behind the teams whenever they get to this point. And the Knicks, it's been I mean,
It's
like you
been
said, it's been a long
forever. We haven't won a title since like the 70s.
wow.
You
That's
would have been a toddler, and I don't
crazy.
think I was
That's
born.
wild.
Like it was bad.
I it's but this is why I find it fascinating because it's just like I love seeing New Yorkers gather together or behind their sports teams. I love seeing you pull out your Knicks hat and being able to wear it because through the years, Jenna, when we worked together when we were working at Metro Focus, I remember we'd be like, I just remember you'd always talk about your Knicks. Didn't you have shoes? Wasn't
Yeah,
it the
no, I had
shoes?
high heels. I did an interview
I
with the
remember.
guest where I brought out my Knicks heels.
You're gonna have to
And
post this picture on
of
of
course,
this.
I'll
So
post the picture from the interview, but yeah, the guest Michael Rapaport, because I didn't want you to be offended by the shoes here.
No, no,
The Knicks shoes
the shoes are
just for you.
I wish I would wear those if you made those in my size with the high heels. I'm not just impressed with the shoes. I'm jealous of the shoes. Can the cameras? Can these
Can we
robots
zoom in? We'll get them. I still love the Knicks, so
listen? Your shoes. Can I take one of these off and make sure? Listen,
wait, there
these
you
shoes.
go.
If anybody out there can make these in a size 12 and a half and men's, I'll wear them with the heels. These are sick. Are these one of a kinds?
No, there's a whole company that
Those
makes
are
them for all
dope.
the team.
Those shoes are they're
All
good.
right, that's the line that I want to end this interview on. My shoes are dope.
Your
Because I
shoes
really
are,
hear that.
those are sick. I'd wear those Knicks shoes, and I'm not even supporting the Knicks right now. I'd wear them with the high heels. Those are dope.
right,
Longtime Knicks fan. Although he was talking about defecting over to Brooklyn because
right.
he had all these issues with, the Knicks team ownership, and God knows everybody does. It's like Yankees fans with the Dolans. That's
Yeah.
how, anyway.
Yes.
Not the
Yeah.
Dolans,
People.
excuse me. The Dolans own the Knicks, Yankees fans with Steinbrenners.
Oh.
Yeah, it's that same kind of acrimonious relationship kind of thing. But still, just the pure joy. And by the way, whatever happens with this series, because again, I don't want to say too much. I don't want to jinx it.
Yeah.
But the Knicks star player, um, Jalen he's getting a statue. Like I don't know if I can really like he's been clutch player of the year several years and well, the last few years he's been clutch player of the year. He steps up and shows up for that team in so many different ways. And I just yeah, I still can't believe last night happened.
Well, I'm glad it happened for you. It's for all the Knicks fans too,
Yes,
because
and
I know
speaking of
it's
Knicks
big.
fans, I also want to say that for our, because I know we don't usually mention the interview that we have coming
Oh
up, but
yes.
yes, for our interview coming up, we're talking with the one, the only great New Yorker, born and bred, by the way, didn't move here from Ohio. That's a whole nother conversation. Ben Max. And one of the things, if you listen all the way to the end, Ben talks about the importance of basketball to New Yorkers, to New York City,
hmm
because this is a basketball city,
hmm
and in a lot of ways, having local journalists who hold government officials to account over the
hmm
state of our public
Yep.
courts, that's one of the things you lose when you decimate local news.
Yep.
Anyway, what
Wow.
else is happening in sports?
Well, going from the Knicks to this next story, people are gonna think they're listening to a sports podcast, but they're
I
not.
know.
So our next headline is basically looking at when the interviewer becomes the story. And what I mean by that is, so a couple of weeks ago, uh, there were a couple of interviews that went viral. And not because of the fact of what was said, but because of what the interviewees did not want to talk about. First, there was Bill Belichick. So he did an interview with CBS Sunday Morning, Saturday. I thought it was Saturday morning, but either
I thought
way, it
it was
was
Sunday morning.
Oh, it was okay.
We're not the age demographic to
You know
watch it
what?
anyway, so
Yes,
we're both like,
is
I don't
that
know.
bad?
It's
I'm
on
like,
the
wait a minute,
weekend.
Saturday or Sunday. Um, but either way, he did this interview, and it was so for those who don't know, Bill Belichick, former Patriots coach, he was on.
Boo,
I'm
Boston.
with
I
yes,
know.
and then
Sorry.
promoting. He was there promoting his new book about his life and career. Well, the vibe kind of shifted, and the interviewer was Tony DeCopel, and the vibe kind of with Tony, they were talking about the book and about his life, and then Tony asked a question of the 73-year-old Belichick about how he and his 24-year-old girlfriend, Jordon Hudson, met. And Jordon was off camera, and you see her jump in and say, she shuts down the questioning, and she says, "We're not talking about this." And in a voiceover, Tony DeCopel kind of explains that, Jordon was there throughout, her presence was felt throughout the day in the interview. And then Belichick later on goes on to release a statement saying that that topic about his relationship with Jordon was not supposed to come up. And then CBS News pushed back saying that there were no preconditions or limitations to the conversation, which we will get into, since we've worked in news and worked in talking with people, we'll talk a little bit about that whole issue later. Now, there's another story that with actor Walton Goggins. Walton Goggins has been on things like Righteous Gemstones. He also was just part of the latest season of White Lotus. So Walton sat down with the Times of London for an interview about his new film called The Uninvited, which was directed by his wife, Nadia Connors. So the reporter, Ed Potton, asked him a question. He asked Walton a question about his White Lotus co-star, Amy Lou Wood. And there have been rumors that the two fell out, like that there's some kind of feud going on between them, but nobody knows for sure. And the reporter asked, and then Goggins was like, listen, I'm not going to have that conversation. He heard the question. He's like, I'm not going to have that conversation. And the reporter circled back a second time, asking kind of about that same thing in a different format. And then the third, and Walton Goggins like, I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to talk about it. On the third try, Walton just was like really frustrated. He's like, what the fuck, Ed? He's like, come on, buddy. Like, wow. Like, you're not, and the publicist, Walton's publicist, stopped the conversation. We're ending it here. And that was it. So, here you have these two stories. And I think it's so interesting because, you have, going back to Belichick, we've been part of this world where publicists sometimes, when you have something on for a book, they will tell you there can be a part of the story that either it's part of the book or it isn't part of the book, and something happened and it can be uncomfortable because as a journalist, sometimes you do have to ask the questions of like, hey, so if I don't ask this question, it's going to look really ridiculous. And also as reporters, you shouldn't have any parameters. Like you should be able to ask whatever questions you want. If you're a journalist, when you talk about 60 Minutes, you're talking about like hard news shows, like they really oftentimes like you're not supposed to have like you can't talk about this because it's like that the guest now has control of the interview. They have control of that. And we've seen that. As I know when I've booked people, I've sometimes had to have conversations with the publicist like, well, we're going to have to ask this question because it's out there in the news. And there have been times where the publicists were like, well, we're not going to come on then because we don't feel comfortable. We don't want to get into it. It's like, I'm sorry. And we just don't have them on. But when I saw like the Belichick interview, I was like, I believe CBS because I can imagine CBS is not going to not ask that question. Now, whether or not you don't have, as a guest, you don't have to answer the question, but you can't control whether or not it gets asked. And I think that's one thing. And then the Walton Goggins thing to me was a totally different topic in the sense of I think sometimes there are journalists who like to me when I see that story, like I didn't feel like the whole Amy Lou Wood, like any kind of personal feud between he and a fellow actor. Number one, there was nothing public made about that feud happening. It's been gossip. Yes, you can see kind of that there might be something going on, but it feels very gossipy. And I feel like even though I get that people want to know sometimes, you just don't know. And as a reporter, you have the right to ask the question. But I do think once you start tapping into asking it two or three more, like another two times, it's like now it just feels like, I don't know. To me, like, I mean, as you, Jenna, as the person doing the interviews, how does it have you ever been in a position where you're like, I'm going to keep hammering that question over and over again till I get an answer I want?
Only to elected officials because they are obligated to answer to the press. I don't, again, I've never done like Hollywood reporting. I could care less about salacious gossip. And unless it pertains to the story, like, say if you're, okay, I can't believe I'm bringing up this example, but say you're writing a book or you're promoting a movie about, I don't know, sexual assault or something, and you have your own accusation that you're just not addressing, then yes, that pertains to the story. But like
Mm-hmm.
otherwise, the salacious gossip part of it, and also in all fairness to the, not in all fairness, but also to the whole Belichick story, a big part of the reason why the girlfriend gets brought up is that Bill Belichick for years had been very sort of like, almost withdrawn from the press. He wasn't very gregarious at all. Like if you would talk to him, it was like almost monosyllabic, one word answer. Like that was who he was. And then suddenly he gets with this 24, 22-year old,
4 year old,
whatever the deal.
24.
Yeah. And is all over Instagram, posting pictures, couple selfies, da 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 da.
Yoga.
And like everybody was like, I'm sorry, Invasion of the Body Snatchers. What is going on here? That's part of the reason why that literally got brought up was because this is such a huge departure from the way the public has known you. Again, that I think is a valid question. Is it something that we need to hammer down? No. To me, the only people who need to be like that definitely need to be hammered down on something are people who are affecting the public interest or the public good.
Mm-hmm.
If it's just salacious gossip,
I
yeah,
agree.
you can ask. But if they're just like, I don't want to talk about that, that in of itself is an answer.
Because it's
Because
got
if
to be
there's nothing to
uncomfortable.
hide, then there's.
But right. I mean, again, I know what it's like when I'm setting up the interview for that particular story. Like sometimes I know there's going to be, but as the person on the other end, as the reporter and as the host doing the interviews, is it ever awkward when you're having a great interview, you're having a great time, then somewhere in that interview, there's a question you're going to ask because
It
whether
depends
it's a
on
story that's
how,
a,
like, if it's something, first of all, it's something that, was already in my one sheet that, like, I can build up, like, listen, I know this is awkward, but I do need to ask this, blah, 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 blah,
I
blah.
remember.
There's been
Yeah.
other times when, again, because if you're on broadcast, you have an earpiece, and I've
Yeah.
had, producers in my ear, ask them about this. And I'm like, that's super awkward and out of left field. But again, keeping in mind, that's not the journalists at the end of the day. That's the producer's call. There's someone in a control room who's telling that host or reporter, you have to ask this question. So now I have to, again, because there's a hierarchy, I have to
Yeah.
ask the question. And so there have been one or two times where I've asked that, but trust me, it was as awkward for me as it was for the guest who was like, the
Yeah.
fuck? And I'm like, bruh, if you can hear what's in my head right now, I wasn't.
But I do think this is an interesting, this happens a lot, and you see it happening a lot in the press of, again, where it isn't this interview as a whole it isn't what's making the headlines. It's the tension between the reporter
And
and the
sometimes that's
and the
what people are
guest.
going for, is
Yeah.
to just have that tension. And then that in and
Yep.
of itself becomes the story, as you're pointing out.
Yep.
But that's never
Well,
been my interest. Well, anyway, there's still lots of tension and intrigue and interest in local news, especially when it comes to city government. And with the loss of so many amazing journalists and reporters, you lose a lot of that stuff. Because, like I said, the only people who I felt completely justified in like hammering and driving home a
hmm
question and like, oh, girl, I could ask this 10,000 different
hmm
ways if you want to keep doing rounds. Those are elected public officials. And again, increasingly, we're seeing more and more not elect, excuse me, local journalists who are the ones who hold these individuals to account, their feet to the fire, getting laid off and let out of the industry. And even though he still has his amazing podcast, um, which of course,
Max Politics,
yes,
yes.
Max Politics podcast, where journalist extraordinaire for New York City, local politics for New York City, um, Ben Max has in-depth conversations with local officials, et cetera. And again, people who are directing public policy. Uh, Still, this is the kind of journalism that we're losing out on in print,
Mhm.
etc., when local news outlets shut down. And again, listen all the way in because we actually also talk about the importance of basketball in New York, and it is very important. Our guest this week is Ben Max. Ben is somebody who knows a lot about what goes on in New York and what it takes to run this place, which is really no small feat. Now, we first met Ben when we worked at our former PBS member station for the news magazine Metro Focus, where he was always the go-to guest for his sharp insight on city politics and state government. Ben spent years at Gotham Gazette, a digital news site that covered local government and the issues that really matter to New Yorkers. But like many news outlets, especially the local ones, Gotham Gazette had to pause due to financial struggles. So, like many journalists, Ben made a pivot. And now he's executive editor and program director at the City Center for New wait at the Center for New York City and New State Law at New York Law School. That is a mouthful, Ben, and I feel like you're going to correct me, which I think is justified. Anyway, he continues to host his podcast, Max Politics, where he chats with elected officials, candidates, and advocates about the ins and outs of New York politics. Ben, it's so great to have you on again.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So first of all, how did I butcher your title? Because I could feel it in the moment, but I
No,
just
you
kept
got it.
going.
You did it in the correction there. That was all good. So I'm running things at the Center for New York City and State Law at New York Law School.
Awesome. All right. So with that, then, um, you've had, as I think, an in-depth career, but unlike myself and Dominic, you didn't automatically come into journalism. This was something that you pivoted to begin with. So can you just give us a quick little background about how you even became a journalist?
Sure. And by the way, thank you for those kind words in the introduction. I appreciated all the
They're
information.
legitimately true. There's no
I
need to
They
lie
are.
appreciated.
anymore.
Yeah.
I appreciated all the invitations onto Metro Focus. So I still sometimes now I'm more than a dozen years into working as a journalist. I still sometimes am surprised that I'm a journalist. It really didn't happen in a planned way. So basically, out of college, I wound up going into education, and I worked in education in different ways for about a decade, including I got my master's in teaching and was a high school history teacher for about 6 years. And I was considering a move back to New York City around that time. I grew up in Queens and always wanted to come back to the city, but I was in the Boston area where I'd gone to grad school and was teaching. So I was thinking about coming back to New York City. This is right around 2012, and was thinking about moving out of the classroom, but more into like education, policy, management, et cetera. So I made a move back to New York City and was starting to really figure out my next step professionally. And as I was looking at a whole bunch of possibilities, I also was getting very interested in the election cycle that was about to really take hold in New York City in 2013, but it was really starting in 2012 with a lot of candidates starting to announce their intention to run for mayor and other offices. This was going to be at the end of Michael Bloomberg's 12 years as mayor. So there were a lot of people itching to run for mayor and other offices, and there was going to be a huge upheaval in New York City government. So I started to really get into that election cycle and start paying attention to who was running for what and different things. And actually, as I was researching so much of it, I found that I couldn't easily find that information anywhere. So, long story short, I decided to just sort of make a website with very rudimentary skills that I had at the time from when I was a teacher, and I made websites for my classes that just sort of put who was running for each office very early on. So, when candidates would declare for anything from mayor to a city council race or whatever, I would have it all in one place, who was running for what, and some other details about the election cycle that was unfolding. And that project then just sort of took took off for me, and I started to put more time into it, a little bit of money into it, and got other people involved with it. And that was really my entryway into journalism. And I actually wound up creating this site and developing it to a place where it was a solid resource for a lot of people in the 2013 election cycle. And I sort of became something of an expert on those elections and started to write things and go on programs and different things to discuss the elections. And that was sort of how it happened, but it was very much on something of a whim and worked out very nicely.
No, I think it worked out great. One of my favorite parts of, at least Dom, for you and me doing this podcast, is as we find out how the different paths that people took to this career, it's
Mhm.
never linear for anybody. But anyway, Dom, I know you had a question too.
No, I think it's fascinating because, just even hearing your story of my path to journalism, also, as Jenna knows, it wasn't planned. It's not like I think a lot of what it takes is being loving actually telling stories. And also, you had always a passion of making things really digestible, like making things digestible for the audience you're speaking to, explaining things that can be complicated. And when you talk about local and city government, sometimes it gets complicated, all the laws and whatever's here. And you always manage to sort of put that clearly to the audience. I guess my thing is, with so much of like local journalism, I feel like that's part of local journalism is there to really explain a lot of the things, the intricacies and the things that you don't always get from national shows. Um, what is it that you fear, like seeing the loss over the past few years, how that's impacting how people consume their news, how people are getting the news and getting the right news, the facts?
Well, one of the things that drew me to journalism was that it felt like a little bit of an extension of teaching and education because it is in a way, right? Especially if you're doing it with the right intentions and you're trying to really inform the public. So, that was a nice extension for me of something that felt just motivating for me, having been a teacher and then being interested in sort of what's next in something in that realm, and it happened to be a bit of a turn, but it still felt under the same broader umbrella. Um, you know, we have still a very robust press corps, in New York City, and I think there's a lot of good journalism that's happening covering New York City politics and government and policy, but there have been huge challenges over the last bunch of years now with the scaling back at a number of publications and then others going out of circulation or business, but some new ones popping up. I do think that there is really excellent coverage in some ways for the public to consume, but we are still missing. We still have big gaps in the local media ecosystem in New York City, especially because it is such a big, vast, complex city. There's so many elected officials and appointed officials trusted with doing so much for the public with public funds for the public good that need to be held accountable. And then so much as you got at, just with helping people understand what's going on, helping people understand why certain decisions are important and how they impact them, plus the accountability side. So, I think there is a good bit out there for people to consume if we can get them to do so. And that's the other big hurdle here is the challenges with engaging people in New York City in their local government and politics. And that's obviously borne out in some of the voter turnout numbers and more. But when I look at when I survey the lay of the land and consume as a news consumer a lot about New York politics and government, I'm mostly still pretty pleasantly surprised, even if I, do more in the fact that we've lost certain publications and shows and other entities, and know that there's gaps in the coverage. There's a lot out there for people who want to go find it.
Oh, absolutely. My one of the things that I've never understood, and again, I am drawn to things like local politics, but how especially voter turnout in New York can sometimes be as low as it is, because especially for the mayor's race, it's frighteningly entertaining, I think is the best way to describe it. And I'm just wondering if you were to weigh in on what seems like the new debate in journalism, which is social media and influencer versus legacy or traditional journalism. Do you see a place where the two can sort of coexist? Because in some cases, especially for younger generations, it seems as if the kids are, that's where they are. That's where they're looking to get their news and information versus having somebody who has been trained as a journalist, who doesn't really understand ethics, who might not have the historical background as to why New York City mayoral races are what they are, is in those spaces giving information.
I mean, I think I don't have a great answer for your question. I think it's one of the great sort of challenges of our time right now. There's ways in which influencers and people on different social media and elsewhere can actually give helpful bite-sized information. You talk about making things digestible. There's ways in which that happens a lot, but you also lose depth, you lose context. Hopefully, perhaps some of that can get people interested in finding out more, but we obviously have had this very big social challenge about people just looking for the bite-sized information and that's enough, or not having the media literacy to know what's good information, what's not, or have a more skeptical eye or ear for all that. And that's one of the most troubling parts of it for me, is that the people who want to look more in depth, more carefully at things, seem to be a shrinking number. And you have people getting media from so many places and sources. There's ways in which, of course, diversifying the media ecosystem is good, and then there's ways in which it's just a huge problem. And we see that in the data around, younger generations not having that media and digital literacy, and the problems that causes. So that always makes me think about, how are we sort of approaching young people in schools and doing some of that instruction that just seems to be so missing to such a high degree than it's present. Teaching things like digital and media literacy in schools, which would be so valuable if that would be widespread. There are ways. The biggest caveat to all that, that I think is a positive, is that there are ways that people on, celebrities and influencers and others will take on a cause or a candidate or whatever it might be, promote an election, that can have positive benefits. And that's where you see, some of the convergence in your question. But unfortunately, I think
It just feels like the question of the moment that the industry, one of the
yeah.
many questions that the industry is facing.
Well, and as you get at, it's also a question of even legacy media entities. How do they approach the modern news consumer, and how people get their information, and whether they are, trying to reach people everywhere, and what kind of resources you put into that, as you both, well know, all the history of media outlets, in the digital age, and questions around pivots to video, and you name it. An industry that's always sort of having to think about reinvention.
Looking at even your career, so you worked at Gotham Gazette for what, like 10 years? You worked
Almost,
over,
yeah, very
yeah,
close.
almost that. And then that goes away. And just like we lost our show Metro Focus, it's devastating at first when, because you put everything into it to build this up, to build this machine up of like getting information to people, and then that happens, and it happens usually sometimes really fast, a lot faster than people might think. Some people are like, didn't you know that there was one? Yeah, but sometimes it's, listen, we work in media, there's always a cloud hanging over us.
Mhm.
I'm curious though, how did you find your way though to New York Law School? How did you find your way to that? How did that happen? How did that come about? And also, how do you see that shift for yourself in terms of how you bring your passion for news and journalism?
I feel very lucky. This opportunity lets me keep doing journalism while also then, becoming part of the law school. And, I co-teach a class and I work with students in other ways. And now a lot of my work is events focused, because at this the Center for New York City and State Law at the law school, a lot of what we do is public programming around local government and politics. By the way, open to the public, not just the law school community. Most of our events at the center are available to everyone who wants to come. So that's great. And then there's the other, the other work of journalism, writing, editing, continuing to do my podcast. That's all part of this, which is great. It feels like a really sort of perfect opportunity for me. And I think that's part of the reason there was outreach about it from the dean and president at the law school, Anthony Crowell, who knew my work at Gotham Gazette, and sort of we started talking about this possibility not long after I left Gotham Gazette, and they decided to pause the publication. We started talking about this possibility and what it could be like. And for me, it felt risky because I was thinking about just what the next possibility in more traditional journalism would be, but I was also extremely concerned that there wouldn't really be something that I would want in, with a focus on New York, and New York politics and government, because those jobs are shrinking. And thankfully, there's still a robust market for people covering national news, and, especially when you get a change in presidential administrations and things like that. But, the great thing about this is there was a tradition here at the law school of this center, which used to be the Center for New York City Law. We updated the name to City and State to reflect the importance of how important New York State government and policy is to New York City.
Mm-hmm.
I won't go into all that now, but a rich history here at the law school of this center, and sort of time that they were thinking about its next phase. And it was really just a good confluence of how they were thinking about the next phase of the center. I was now a free agent and looking for something. And really a lot of the conversations that I started to have with publications and other entities around covering New York politics and government were tough, because there aren't that many opportunities, and there's certainly, most of the positions generally are reporter positions. When you're coming out having been an editor, I was facing a question about whether I wanted to go do reporting somewhere, and that was interesting to me, but also not exactly what I was looking for. So, this turned out great, and I've been enjoying it in the year plus I've been here so far. But it's definitely different. It's an adjustment, and there's a lot I'm learning along the way.
Well, how are you balancing, I guess? Because again, like you said, you still have your podcast, Max Politics, but at the same time, you're also, if I understand correctly, co-teaching legal journalism reporting. Um, how do you balance the two? Or is it a much more simple balance than people are thinking?
Well, I mean, it's definitely different types of work, in terms of like how you have to think about the conversations you're having and your audience, and all of that. So, I'm going into this class each semester now, teaching law students a little bit about journalism, basically, and about New York City government in particular, and about writing and covering New York City government in certain ways. And again, it isn't, the most extensive, in-depth class, because a lot of these students have either no background in journalism or no background in New York City, or both. And so it's really both an introductory class to New York government and to journalism. So that's a whole batch of conversations there, and lessons
Yeah.
and so forth. And then on my podcast, I'm still having these conversations that, my audience is largely people who are insiders in New York government, or just adjacent to that, people who are really into it because they want to hear an hour conversation with the Brooklyn Borough president, Antonio Reynoso, who was a recent guest on the show, right? That's not for everybody. But, one of the things I am trying to do with the podcast still is have it be an experience. If people don't have a background in New York politics or government, they could come into a lot of these conversations, and I hope feel like at least on whatever the issue at hand or the guest at hand, they can really get up to speed in a certain way. And so I really try not to use a lot of like jargon on the podcast, or when my guests do, I try to clarify what it means and give it context, because I do think about the podcast as something of an extension of trying to bring more people into this interest. So, there's a little bit of overlap there, but it is very different, very different work. I'm also editing some of the things we publish through the center at our publications that focus on New York law and land use and government. And then occasionally doing some writing for other outlets, which I haven't been doing enough of, but I want to do more of. But it's definitely an adjustment moving into being part of an academic institution. I mean, that was not anything that I've been doing, at least since I was a high school teacher. So that's been a big adjustment for sure.
I'm also wondering, as you're talking about, the difference between the two, but mostly about your podcast and how it can be a little bit insidery. I'm wondering, with the loss of local journalism in the larger sense for the country, where you now have these news deserts, how much, when you think about how much detail and how much information that you're able to engage with local officials, does that at all give you any consideration for what a lot of people might be missing out on, or just simply don't have access to that information simply because there isn't something similar like that in other parts of the country?
I'm so, it's such a great question, but I'm so focused on New York, and especially New York City, with an extension to sort of state government and how it impacts New York City, that's often not, on my radar. I when I see the headlines or sometimes engage with the articles or the segments of a show that are on, the loss of local news around the country, I mean, it tears me up. And of course, there's related issues in New York, like we've been discussing. Um, you know, there are live discussions that I think are too often now on the back burner about how to reinvigorate local news in New York and across the country. It needs less reinvigoration in New York, as I was mentioning,
Yeah.
thankfully, but um, you know, with the financial models collapsing and all of that, it's tough. And so your question though also gets me thinking though about something I think about all the time, which is, how we all think about audience. And I'm wrestling, like I said, an hour with the Brooklyn Borough president. I have people all the time who tell me they listen to the first half hour of an episode, right? And they're like, I couldn't do an hour, like I couldn't give you an hour, and I try to make it an interesting conversation, but I totally get that. And I'm always wrestling with, maybe I should make these episodes shorter, make them more digestible for people, and a little bit more bite size, or 3 bites instead of, six. But I like to err on the side of going more in depth. And if, there's people out there who like going for the whole thing, great. And if there's some people who only listen to part, okay. But I am constantly reevaluating that and thinking about that. And, you
But
know,
yeah, I was gonna say you're preaching to the choir over here, so
yeah, no, I was just going to say, I don't know what you guys think. We're in a world and an age where everything seems to be getting more and more bite size and shorter. And even in written journalism, it's all about, keep it under, a lot of it, keep it under 600 words, keep it this, keep it tight. And
bullet points where I'm seeing
yeah,
more and more that show up, and I'm just like, so we're doing this now?
But yeah, but it's weird because really, when you look at this, though, Ben, too, like, listen, when there are other podcasts, I listen to a bunch of movie podcasts and pop culture, and they're on for 3 hours,
right.
and people listen to them. I think it really depends. I think sometimes it could be twofold, right? There are times where you could get, it's almost like you do want bite size when it comes to give me the top, what's happening today. I don't necessarily want to get into all that information. And some news organizations kind of fit that. But then sometimes you do want to hear and you do want that extra info. You do want to hear what that person sounds like, that borough president who's running for office next time. And it's like, I want to know what they stand for, and people will listen to it. I feel like that's the tough part of news today is everybody, I sort of what's like Jenna, we've discussed this too, of keeping the episodes down to a certain, maybe you don't want to go over an hour because, do you lose the audience? And you want whatever audience you get to listen to. But at the same point, Ben, it feels like, as journalists, sometimes like, what is it? What's the purpose that we have, right? What is it that we're passionate about? And if we like talking and we want to get in depth to something, is that maybe are we cutting something out? Like if I'm willing to listen to that, why wouldn't other people be willing to listen to it?
Well, and I mean, and two things. One, we always need to be sort of reevaluating what we assume or what we think one
Mhm.
way or the other,
Always.
you know, and also trying to evaluate whatever metrics we can identify, right, to
Mhm.
help us understand the
Mhm.
data. Um, but also two, you know, make it good, right?
Mhm.
Number one, make it good. Make it obviously it has to be accurate and ethical and all the very most foundational elements of anything that's journalistic. But the next thing is make it good and people will listen, make it interesting and people will listen. And that's a lot of what you're getting at there. So that's a lot of what I try to do. For me, I when I was running Gotham Gazette, what one thing I liked about it is that we did sort of have an ethos of erring on the side of being more thorough. And it was like, all right, if you want the bite-sized news of the day, there's places to get that. If you want the more in-depth piece that really tries to give you a more full picture on an issue or a trend or whatever it might be, then we've got you covered. And that led to a certain niche that was appreciated by a certain solid audience and an audience that was growing year after year. And I like that. So when I come to continue doing that work on the podcast, which I've been hosting now for almost a decade. Well, I was co-hosting it at first, and then my
I
co-host moved
remember.
on from journalism. But um, doing it on my own now since 2021. I've extended some of the conversations. Actually, I used to try to keep them all under 35 minutes. And now, I'm targeting more 45 to an hour with guests because there's only so much you can get to in even a half hour.
I
So,
was gonna say, and with politicians, sometimes it
yeah,
can take just that first 20 minutes just to get them warmed up.
exactly. I mean, that's my thing is I often want to give them 20 minutes to get their main talking points out of the way. Not that they're not interesting most of the time, but it's like, all right, talk about the things that you came here that you really want to talk about. All right, and then let's get to my stuff.
Exactly.
Let me
Yeah.
let me start pushing you on some stuff or get into some things that maybe you don't want to talk about as much, but hey, now you have a chance to. So I like the in-depth. I like that, and I try to offer, people something good. And that's sort of the goal. But to your point, it's also like, what do I enjoy? And if I have a venue to do something that I enjoy, then let's keep doing it.
Is that the type of thing that you are, I guess, imparting on your students to keep in mind for their own work, especially if they're doing anything that's going to be journalism related? Uh, First and foremost, learning how to get politicians to talk past the talking points and actually talk. But yeah, like, I mean, is that something that you're considering, and especially in this, as we discussed, this hyper digital age?
Well, I think for the students I'm working with, most of the time, these are students who are going to become lawyers. They
Hmm.
are So a lot of what we're trying to do in the legal journalism class is actually really just work on the writing and the thinking about writing for clarity and in some ways for brevity, but also helping law students, just like often has to happen in my experience working with reporters in a newsroom for a news publication, is working with them on thinking through how to present material to an audience that doesn't have a lot of background in the issue in understandable ways, but not stripping it down so much that it doesn't have any depth either, right? So finding that balance, and so that's a lot of what we're working on there. But I am talking with the students about quality, and also about interest, right? If you can do work that you're interested in, then it at least I don't know that I believe at all in the old cliches about like it doesn't feel like you're really working, but at least like
Yes, it's
somewhere in
working.
between.
Yes.
Um, but that's why what I try to do even in the class is give options for the topics they write about because I do want them to try to cover something in some of the assignments that they're interested in. So I'll give them a menu and I'll even say, you know, or if you don't like these topics, you can come to me with another one for approval or disapproval that you want to write about. But like, I think there's, in life and in work, there's so much that's about engagement. If you yourself are engaged, that helps the audience, right, with the product that you're putting forward. And that's why I hope, the people that listen to the podcast that I host, get a sense that like I'm really enjoying it and I enjoy doing it and bringing it to people. Even though on my podcast, I try to talk almost as little as possible. I'm interviewing people and sort of peppering them with questions, and that's the way I like to do that.
Ben, that is not the mark of a good host. You should love the sound of your own voice.
I don't I like to chime in a little bit, but it's so funny. Sometimes I do wish that I had a show where it was sort of like me and a co-host or two just sort of talking about the week's news or talking about, but that's just not, the show that I developed. And I really also like having on elected officials and others to ask them questions. And so, sometimes I do miss the thing, that I'm not doing regularly. But I really like interviewing people who are in positions of power or seeking positions of power, to sort of try to put them through their paces a little bit.
Well, hold accountability. And there's some story you share with us, actually. It was funny. It was about 10 years ago. You were talking about how you noticed city council members were showing up late. And I think it's a great story that exhibits why having somebody so hyper focused or hyper local to to news, what difference that makes. Can you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, and just on the general theme, I mean, I do think to tie it together with things that you all are talking about all the time and that we're talking about here in terms of the loss of local media, the importance of holding government accountable, whether it's elected officials or appointed officials like, deputy mayors or commissioners or whoever it might be. It's just so important, the old cliche of follow the money and all of that, that accountability is so important. And that is part of what we absolutely have lost, some of with some of the, hollowing out of the local media landscape here, and certainly to a big degree in other parts of the country, as we were talking about. So, this has always been one of my favorite parts of journalism is the accountability piece. And, um, uh, roughly a decade ago, probably more, 8 years ago or so, I was noticing that for a lot of New York City Council hearings, the council members would be coming in late or not at all, or, missing hearings. Now, in their defense, city council members sit on a lot of different committees, and sometimes those committees have like hearings at the same time. And it's very tricky, and maybe they should have fewer committees in the city council. We did an article on that at least once. But this trend of these city council hearings starting late or starting with only the chair there, or maybe the chair of the committee and one other, council member when there's 8 on the committee. So I sort of started to just tweet about this issue and say, I would be at the hearing and I would say, oh, the, city council public safety committee hearing on, the NYPD budget or something like that hasn't started yet. And it was supposed to start 20 minutes ago, and sort of starting there. And there's only one council member here. And, starting to tag different council members who were on the committee, but not there, and in retrospect, some of this was like slightly unfair because I didn't know where they were, right? So maybe they were at a different committee hearing, which some of them wound up tweeting back at me sometimes. But again, that added to the transparency of it. So long story short, I started to do a bit of that on Twitter, and then actually assign some reporters to work on a story about how often the city council was, starting hearings late, what the attendance issues were like, commentary from people in city government more broadly about how these hearings were or were not effective. And it felt like a really good accountability tool. And I had someone, we did a whole series on this, and it was, really about how effective the city council was or was not being in holding the mayoral administration accountable and providing more checks and balances. And, I had someone from working in the city council who sort of called it to me in a conversation, an audit of the city council. And that kind of felt good. I felt proud of that we were doing that, public service accountability of the legislative body that's supposed to do its own accountability of the mayoral administration, which is hugely powerful.
Well, for me, one of the questions that I've always wondered is, and this might be a little bit too much, but I love when I'm able to take something outside of journalism that I am exceptionally passionate about and find a way to shoehorn it. And there have been times where I have shoehorned a story into my beat because, damn it, I'm not going to miss this. And with that, I will say I am a huge, huge Knicks fan. So I'm wondering if there were ever, Ben, I know that you enjoy basketball as well, as I
I
think
do.
every New Yorker is entitled to. Is there ever a way that you could see yourself perhaps having some sort of larger conversation? Like maybe if it's the parks department wanting to redo all the city's basketball courts or something.
This is so funny that you're asking me this conversation because this just came up, and we didn't talk about this before taping this. So this was very funny. I recently moderated a mayoral candidate forum on parks and recreation. And this is like, I'm actually embarrassed, very slightly telling the story based on your question because I didn't do something that I was going to do. So most of the questions were just given to me by the advocacy groups that we were co-hosting the forum with. I was really just there to moderate, to ask the questions, move it along, ask some
Yeah, I've
follow-up
been in that
questions.
situation.
Yeah. So they weren't my questions, but I had them in advance and I was tweaking a tiny bit, and then there was a lightning round at the end. So I decided, okay, I'm going to add one of my own questions to the lightning round, which is, would you commit tonight as mayor, to a program of putting up nets at all of the outdoor basketball hoops across the city, because there's almost no nets anywhere you go. But then, we were getting sort of towards the end, and it was time to wrap it up. So I cut my own little quick lightning round question off. But then afterward, I was like, why didn't I just ask that question? It was getting at one of my issues, and my, issues near and dear to me, which is when I like take my son to go shoot hoops at the park, and there's no net on the hoop, and it's nice to have a net. So anyway, that makes me think of that. I would love to do more where I can figure out more of the confluence of sports and politics, and I will think more about that now that you prodded me on that.
Ah, well, there you go. A little creative shoehorning, and it's possible. And again, if there is ever a reason for New Yorkers to, I'm assuming they would just dismantle the city if the Knicks ever went all the way.
Oh my
Um,
gosh.
I would be more than happy to join in some way in the celebration because I don't think any of us would be able to believe what we're witnessing. But miracles always happen, and you got to believe.
Hey, listen, the Knicks, as we speak here, look like they're, in good shape to go on to the second round of the playoffs. So you never know. This is
Exactly.
probably not their year for an NBA championship, but you never know.
Which is, I
Things
think,
happen.
something every journalist probably takes with them as their career goes through its ups and downs. You never know.
Well, also that, yes, and even what I just said, I mostly would not say that covering politics, right? I would mostly, what I try to do is really not jump ahead.
Hmm.
I really try not to forecast or predict. I try
Hmm.
to like say this is where things stand now. This is the best information we have now. When you, again, comparing, let's say, the NBA playoffs to the mayoral race that's unfolding right now, like you can't assume, you can't look too far ahead. Just like, there could be a major injury that shakes up the playoffs. A leading mayoral candidate can have a scandal. I mean, these things happen all the time. So another good lesson of journalism, right? Don't try to predict the future.
Very true. With that, Ben, thank you so much for joining us. It's been so great to talk to you again. Always love Max Politics. I feel like Well, yeah, I feel like I'm learning something that I'm actually hearing from the people who are either vying to be leaders of the city or are, and at least, especially when I was working on Metro Focus, made me a better question asker when I would engage with those.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking with you guys, and I appreciate those kind words, and that's what I'm trying to do, and I enjoy it. So, but this was really fun to talk about journalism and chat with you guys, and I appreciate the way that you are sort of trying to regularly lift the veil on what journalists do and a lot about like the decisions that we have to make with our careers and where we're going and sacrifices and all that. So thank you for that and for this conversation.
Awesome. All right.
Thanks, Ben. Bye.
Bye. Laid Off and Looking is an independent podcast conceived of and created by Jenna Flanagan and Dominic Camia.
Music provided by Jake Howitt. Research by Laura Rothenbucker.
You can watch and follow us on YouTube.
Or you can listen and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you have any questions or suggestions, we want to hear from you. So leave a comment.
We do check them.
Or reach out to us anytime at laidoffandlookingpod@gmail.com.
New episodes every Friday.